Hi, welcome back to the basement. I'm Steve Lewis. Today I am very pleased and honored to have Jim Murphy returning to the basement, albeit virtually. Jim first joined us in episodes 143 and 144 back in the fall. He is, of course, the author of Becoming the Beach Boys, 1961 through 1963, easily the greatest book ever written about the early days of the group, and also the author of the liner notes for the Becoming the Beach Boys CD set, the premiere set of recordings from those Height and Dorinda Morgan sessions in the early 60s. Apart from being back by popular demand, Jim is a great guy, somebody I wanted to talk to again. He's going to share some more of his really incredible collectibles with us. That'll be in an upcoming episode. In this episode, we started out by talking about the very early foundations of the Beach Boys, their influences, and why they became the kind of band that they did. Of course, the conversation, as it does, always ranges a little bit, and we go off on some tangents, which is one of the things I really enjoy about talking to Jim. I will stop talking, we'll get to it. This will be part one of probably three, I think, because it was just a great conversation. We covered so much, I want to get as much in as possible. So I'll shut up. Please enjoy Jim Murphy. We're back with Jim Murphy. We last talked last fall, and it's great to see you. Thanks for being on the show again. And I admire your Pendleton shirt, very much in the spirit of. And I did want to talk about the very early formation of the group, their very early days, and their dues paying. Greg Dolan just recently had written in, and he thought that maybe the Beach Boys became successful so quickly with what appeared to be a minimum of dues paying, based on the fact that they had family sing-alongs, that they all knew each other, that sort of substituted for some amount of getting a band together and getting to know each other and playing small clubs and things. Do you think there's something to that?
I saw Greg's comment about that, and that's a good thing because I don't think it's dues paying in the traditional sense, like the dues paying that the Beatles did. The Beatles paid their dues by actually playing coffee houses, clubs, obviously the Cavern Club, gig after gig after gig. So by the time they become successful, they had so many live shows under their belt. They had played probably hundreds of times. So they were a really well-oiled machine. The Beach Boys dues paying was different. It wasn't so much early gigs and going from show to show and carrying the stuff in the station wagon and things like that. They did that after they became famous. So their dues paying probably needs a better term, actually. It was more like preparation. And I think it really begins probably, I would pin it to 1955, when Brian is driving around Hawthorne with his mother, Audrey, and he hears Day by Day by the Four Freshmen on the radio. And he just loves the song. Of course, Brian grows up in a musical family. Audrey could play piano, Murray could play piano. They had a jukebox, they had a piano, they had music in the family. The Wilson boys grew up with a lot of music. They heard it all the time. Of course, they heard the music that their parents loved, which is pretty typical. But Ryan hears the Four Freshmen and he's just enchanted by it. And he buys the record, he buys the album that it's from. He bought all their albums, and that becomes his musical education. He also liked the High-Lows, which was another vocal harmony group. He liked Rosemary Clooney, the vocalist. Right. We had these musical influences, but especially the Four Freshmen. And he comes home from school and he's just piano and record player. And he's dropping the needle on the vinyl album and he's figuring it out chord by chord, note by note. And he does this from 1955 basically to 1961. And then that's 5 or 6 years of him intensely studying. You couldn't probably put that up against a college education in music. I mean, right. That was his musical education. Christmas of 1958, Carl Wilson gets a guitar. His next door neighbor, David Marks, also gets a guitar. So they both get these relatively inexpensive guitars that were carried by Sears at the time. I think David Marks had what's called the Kentucky Blue Silvertone. Carl had a K Swingmaster, relatively inexpensive guitars, but good enough for beginner guitars. And they both began listening to Chuck Berry, trying to copy his riffs. They both take lessons from John Moss, M-A-U-S, who becomes one of the Walker brothers later on. John is an older guy. He plays guitar. He teaches David Marks some things. Mark says, hey, I got a buddy named Carl. He'd like to take some lessons too. So David and Carl start playing guitar together. They love all the guitar guys at the time, Dwayne Eddy, especially Chuck Berry, and they start playing together. And that begins in Christmas of 58. So when the Beach Boys really hit in late 61 and then later on in 62, Carl and David have been playing together for a couple of years. Ryan, since 55, has been working on his own musical education of basically dissecting the harmonies of the Four Freshmen. There's this great story where Murray and Audrey have tickets to see the Four Freshmen at the Crescendo in 1958. In May of 58, the Four Freshmen, they're at the Crescendo for, I think, a week or something, or multiple engagement night. And they didn't have enough tickets for the three of them to go. So it's decided that Murray is going to go with Brian because Brian is such an admirer of the Four Freshmen. So they go, they see this show. Brian is just enthralled. Murray, blustery Murray, kind of works his way backstage with his young son, and they meet the Four Freshmen. I had the honor of speaking to Bob Flanagan, who is sadly no longer with us, but I spoke with him while I was writing the book. And he remembered meeting Brian, actually. And he said he was very well composed, very respectful. He knew what he wanted to do. A firm handshake, looked me right in the eye. He was a very driven kind of young kid. In 1958, in May of 58, Brian is just a couple of weeks away from turning 16.
Yeah.
So he's still a young kid. But he knew then that what he wanted to do, and he just loved meeting the Four Freshmen. A few months later, sometime in the summer of 58, probably June or July of 58, just a couple of months maybe after meeting the Four Freshmen, he looks through the yellow pages in Los Angeles and he finds the Four Freshmen's manager, a guy by the name of Bill Wagner. And he goes down to Wagner's office, or he calls them first, and he says, because I spoke to Bill Wagner, and he says, I'd like to meet with you to talk about the Four Freshmen. So he goes in there, and this was back in the day, I guess, when you could do that, I just love the story because the 16-year-old kid who has the music just pouring out of him, picks up the yellow pages, finds the Four Freshmen's manager, goes down to Hollywood Boulevard and gets a meeting with Bill Wagner. So he says, I love the Four Freshmen. I know all the records by him. So Wagner challenges him. He plays him a song called The Day Isn't Long Enough. And Wagner tells him this was a song that the Four Freshmen had a really hard time recording. This gave them a lot of trouble. The harmonies, the vocals, the moving in, the moving parts, it gave them a really hard time when they recorded it. He plays the song for Brian as a test. Brian listens to it reportedly 4 times. He listens to it, and then he says, okay, I got it. And he goes back and he sings each of the 4 parts perfectly. He sings each one of the Four Freshmen's vocal parts in front of Bill Wagner live. So Wagner says to him, he says, well, you need to get a musical combo, a vocal combo. And Brian says, that's why I'm here.
Oh, yeah.
He says, that's why I'm here. You're going to show me how to do that. And this is what Wagner told me. And I'm writing, I recorded the interview and I'm writing this down for the book. And I'm thinking, this is gold. The material is gold. So that was how dedicated Brian was to music. People like Brian Wilson, they're not like you and me. They have this gift, and when the gift shows itself and just starts to come out of them, there's nothing else they can do. And so Brian has this education. Carl and David have been playing guitars for a number of years. Al Jardine, of course, separately loves the Kingston Trio. He loves Seeger. He loves the folk music kind of thing. And he's playing guitar too. He's got a beat up acoustic guitar that's really hard on the fingers, a nylon or wire strings or whatever. But he's playing too. Mike Love was not a musician, but he just loved music. So he goes to Susan Miller Dorsey High School in Los Angeles, which had a large African-American population. He's exposed to a lot of rhythm and blues, a lot of black music at the time, as well as what's happening with rock and roll. And he gets that fusion of rock and roll, country, and rhythm and blues. And Mike just loves that stuff. And he has a real facility with words. A real quick speaker, a good writer. He loves Chuck Berry. He loves the way Chuck Berry can tell a story in a song. Mike is really, really good at telling a story in a song, evidenced by Do It Again and stuff like that. And then, of course, Murray is a songwriter himself and a much more accomplished songwriter, I think, than people give him credit for. Thanks to guys like George Faulkner, that's becoming more aware, actually. Murray and his connections with the music industry through Height and Dorinda Morgan, they have that readiness. Height and Dorinda Morgan have kind of a makeshift studio in their home to do demos. And then they also have a studio called Stereo Masters where they can do a little bit more professional recording and demos. And he's got a music publishing company, Guild Music, and he's got another one called Prestige, one with BMI and one with ASCAP. So the Morgans were set up with that. And they were on the fringe of the music industry. They had a couple of big hits, Confidential and some of the things. And they had some success with a lot of records. And they have some very cool and very collectible records because they did a lot in the Black and the Chicano community in Los Angeles. So a lot of their records are extremely collectible by R&B R&B collectors these days, which would probably tickle Hype Morgan if he knew that today. So all that mechanism was in place. The demo studio, the music publishing companies through Murray, the home filled with music because Murray and Audrey both loved music and they both played. They were both musical. Murray's songwriting abilities, Brian's education with the Four Freshmen, Carl and David, their guitar adolescence with Chuck Berry and John Moss. So they have this preparation. So they're really, really ready.
Why did they not become a vocal group like the Four Freshmen? Why did they become a self-contained rock combo? I mean, it seems like that Brian might have wanted to form the Four Freshmen Mark II. Was it because that already sounded outdated? Was it to keep the other guys happy? Why didn't they just become another Four Freshmen?
Yeah, that's a good question, actually. I don't know 100%, but my own personal theory is that it was a generational thing. When you look at the Four Freshmen's records and their chart appearances, they were already starting to drop a little bit.
Okay.
Aren't quite the big artists for Capitol as they had been. They were more of a product of the 50s. So I kind of think that Brian loved it, but also he's a young kid. And that was still probably considered his parents' music a little bit. But he's also very much influenced by the Presley explosion, Little Richard, Fats Domino, Dwayne Eddy, Eddie Cochran, Gene Vincent, all that first wave of rock and roll. That's what they're growing up with. That's their high school music. It's interesting. I always believe that the music you love the most is the music of your high school years.
Sure.
And Brian's in high school from 1956 to 1960. And that's pretty much that first wave of rock and roll. So I think they merged that, and that this has been written about by probably every Beach Boy writer since the creation, is the merging of the Four Freshmen harmonies and the rock and roll of Chuck Berry and Buddy Holly and others. So I do think he probably had that vision, but also the influence, I think, of Carl and David, who were even younger, crazy young when you think about it, 13, 14 and a half or something, really, really young, but getting really, really good on the guitar. And so they had a huge influence. So I kind of think, it was more of a generational thing. So it's that, the music of your parents and the generation before you, that you grow up as a kid, that just becomes in your DNA. And then the music of your youth that you experience on your own and in your high school years.
Right.
And it's the melding of that. And that really is kind of a beautiful thing when you think about it, because that's what the Beach Boys did. And, to the other question, or to the original question, rather, Mike Love talks about this very famously. When you look at pictures of Mike Love's mom, first of all, she was just stunningly beautiful. And she had 6 children, 3 boys, 3 girls, very, very well-to-do, very successful business in sheet metal and building commercial kitchens and things like that. They did very, very well at the Love Sheet Metal Company until they didn't do well. But they were doing very, very well. They had a beautiful, big, beautiful home, and kind of contrasted to the Wilsons, who were, in a 2-bedroom bungalow, 1 level.
Right.
Murray struggling with his business, Milton Love doing very, very well. So it was a little juxtaposition there. Mike's mom would always have parties. She was a very social person. So, birthdays and especially Christmas. And the Wilson cousins would be invited over. So Murray and Audrey would pile the 3 Wilson brothers together, and they go over to Mike Love's house. And then Mike tells this great story of the parents breaking off and singing their music. And then the teens, Mike and his 5 siblings, and the 3 Wilson boys, and probably some friends that were in there too, breaking off and singing their songs. And of course, Brian, being a piano player and knowing how to arrange vocal harmony, he was probably doling out parts, and you sing this and you sing that. And Maureen Love, Mike's sister Maureen, played the harp, and she's a musician on her own with her own music and her own albums to this day. And so they kind of had this impromptu singing, So they had this history, and that probably went on for years, maybe even before, the Day by Day in 1955, where the Love Wilson family get together. And Mike always tells the story about Brian singing the old Irish song, Danny Boy, for their grandmother, and just bringing people to tears, because he had this just beautiful, crystal clear voice at a very, very young age. So that was part of their preparation too, the family get-togethers. And there's also something too, and this has been scientifically written about brothers having voices that blend very well together. The structure, the timbre, the tone of the voices. Andy Williams sang with his brothers. There's, the Bee Gees, obviously. There's a lot of examples of family groups singing together, and they just blend, and it might have a genetic basis.
Yeah.
Vocal cords are,
makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that old axiom of preparation meeting opportunity. And the opportunity was when they, when they meet with the Morgans and it's like, hey, do you have anything, commercial? Mike tells this great story of him and Dennis going fishing, probably sometime in August of 61, probably on a weekend because, Mike is married. He's got family responsibilities. He's working. Dennis is 17, I think, at the time, maybe 16 or 17. He's got more of a carefree lifestyle. They go fishing and they talk about the music of the day. And, Mike knows that he comes from a musical family himself, and certainly Brian does. And I guess the idea is just like, hey, we could do this ourselves. We're just as good as anything we're hearing on the radio now. So why don't we write a song? Brian can write the music. I have a good facility with lyrics and singing. And they start working, I think, back at the Wilson home on the song that becomes Surfin'. And part of the genius of it is like they saw this West Coast phenomenon, and it was only on the West Coast of surfing, of this whole culture of people living on the beach and spending the day at the beach. And their idea was, well, no one has ever sung about this. There's been surf music, but it's always been instrumental. Well, why don't we actually sing about it, describe what a day at the beach is like? Anyway, so it had this rudimentary song, and I don't know what stage it was in, but of course, Murray knows Height. Murray has known Height Morgan for years. So I think what happens at some point, Murray calls Height Morgan and says, hey, the boys are trying to put this song together and this group together. Could you listen to it and give them some ideas or some instruction? So they probably go down to Stereo Masters on Melrose Avenue and play a little bit of the song for them or talk about the ideas. And they must audition for the Morgans somehow. But the Morgans see something in them. They knew the Wilson boys growing up. Brian had auditioned for a song for them, years ago. They knew he had a good voice. And they basically say, hey, can you write something in the Chuck Berry vein? Can you write something that would be snappy? The Morgans are always looking for a hit. They're going to put one of their own songs on the B side, which they own the publishing to, of course, and the B side will ride up the charts along with the A side. But they're looking for that A side hit. Dennis and Mike, and yeah, sure, we can write something commercial. In fact, we got this song Surfin' already, and it's kind of we're kicking it around. Let us go back and finish it. And they write this little ditty called Surfin'. 2 minutes and 10 seconds, 3 chords. Pretty simple, heavily influenced by Jan and Dean. Great lyrics. Again, a story song, going surfing, from the surfing report in the morning to going home at night after a long day at the beach. Great lyrics. Mike Love, I think Dennis Wilson is too, uncredited, but great lyrics right out of the gate. It's rudimentary and simple, but it's a great first song. The songwriting contract for Surfin', between Murray signing for his underage son, Brian, Mike signing for himself, and the Morgans, is dated September 15th of 1961. So Surfin' is ready to go in some form, and Morgan signs it to his music publishing company on September 15th, 1961. September 15th, 1961 is a Friday. It's the Friday after school year started. The school year started that previous Monday. So the Labor Day weekend story that, a lot of Beach Boy books have and stuff like that, that's bogus. Nothing happened Labor Day weekend. The only thing that happened Labor Day weekend was Al Jardine turned 19. Labor Day is the last big rush of the summer vacation. The next Monday, school starts. The boys, and just the 4 of them at the time. Jardine is not involved at this point. It's just Brian, Mike, Carl, and Dennis. And they've got Surfin' in some rough form. And then from September 15th, 1961, when they signed the songwriting contract with the Morgans, through probably late November is when they rehearse it. And they do all that practicing there from September 15th for those 2 weeks in September, probably all of October, and a good half of November, probably. They're rehearsing it. When I talked to Bruce Morgan, he was adamant. Bruce was still living at home. I think he was 21 years old, so his memory was in good shape, as far as what was going on. He recalled numerous rehearsal sessions at the Morgans' home on Mayberry Street. Not the studio on Melrose, Stereo Masters, but the home on Mayberry Street, 2511 Mayberry Street. And he said they would rehearse over and over and over again. And he resented them actually at that time because he didn't think they were that good. He said they were young kids, they were goofing around. He didn't know why his parents were putting so much work and effort into these young teenagers who he did not see a future in at all. But his mom especially would work with them and the harmony.
So we'll leave it there for now. There's much more to come with Jim Murphy next time, including some really interesting surprises, so please tune in. Meanwhile, I'd love to hear your comments and feedback as always. Please hit like if you don't mind and subscribe if you haven't. We'll see you next time. Have a good week. Bye.